Thanks so much for joining us today. My name is Elizabeth, and I'm the Development Director at WRA. Let me start by saying thank you. You've all played a critical role in WRA's ability to get real measurable emission reductions, which is the key to fighting climate change. As a nonprofit, WRA can't do our work without donors and partners like you. We appreciate your trust and your commitment to climate solutions with WRA. Today, we wanted you to hear directly from two leaders behind the climate fix, our President, Jon Goldin-Dubois, and Clean Energy Director Erin Overturf. During this webinar, you will hear about WRA's ambitious goals, the remarkable impact we've made across the region, and some key lessons we've learned along the way. We'll also get into what we're focused on now, given the moment at hand and the work left to be done. And there's plenty of it. We're recording this webinar. We're recording the webinar today, so we'll be sharing it with folks who could not attend live. But you'll also see a link in your email if you'd like to revisit this presentation at some point. Finally, we're going to have time at the end for your questions, so please feel free to use the Q&A feature below to submit your questions throughout, or wait till the end. You can add them at your leisure. Okay, so we'll kick off. We're going to talk about how this all started and the importance of setting ambitious goals. Jon, let's start with the big picture. What exactly is the climate fix, and why are we celebrating it right now?
Thank you, Elizabeth, and thank you all for joining us. To your question, the climate fix began 7 years ago with a fundamental question that we were asking ourselves: how could we take aggressive and effective climate action that leads to large-scale carbon emissions reductions, and how do we do it as quickly as the science demands? We knew that in order to do that, we had to have a clear and actionable plan. And so our core strategies that we adopted from the start were pretty straightforward. First, retire coal plants and reduce our reliance on fossil fuels. Second, modernize our electric grid to handle the influx of renewables and to enhance battery storage on the system. Third, invest in as much clean energy as possible, like wind and solar and energy storage. And finally, implement additional energy efficiency measures to make sure we're keeping electricity demand as flat as possible. And as we set out, we initially set our goals to reduce carbon emissions in the interior West by 40% below 2016 levels by 2030, which would equate to roughly 80 million tons of emissions reductions per year. And after initial success in Colorado, we realized that we could aim even higher. So we increased our goal to reduce climate warming emissions across the regional economy by 105 million tons per year. So overall, a 51% decrease from 2016. And I have to tell you, I am so very proud to announce that we've surpassed the initial goal. And right now we've locked in emissions reductions estimated to be at about 91.5 million tons of greenhouse gas emissions reductions across industries, thanks to our work on the climate fix.
That's incredible, Jon. 91 million tons. That's a massive achievement. Jon, most of us have heard the phrase reduce emissions, but what does that really mean in practical terms?
Yeah, it's a good question, Elizabeth. When we talk about reducing emissions, we are talking about cutting down the amount of greenhouse gas emissions like carbon dioxide and methane that are released into our atmosphere. These gases, as you all know, trap heat and are the primary cause of climate change. And in our work, this primarily means moving away from burning fossil fuels like coal and fossil gas to generate electricity, and instead using clean, renewable sources that don't produce these harmful emissions. And it also means making our homes and our transportation system more efficient and cleaner.
That really helps to put it in perspective. Thank you. Erin, turning to you, how did we go about setting these ambitious goals in the first place? What are the biggest sources of emissions that we're tackling here in the West?
Right. So we set our goals based on the best available climate science and what we knew the major utilities in our region would need to accomplish in order to put the broader economy on a path to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. So we focused in on the power sector because that's where our unique skills and expertise are. And in addition, electricity generation has historically been the largest source of climate pollution in our region. This is due to our heavy reliance on coal-fired power plants, which are particularly emissions intensive. So as we started to make solid progress on the power sector, we saw an opportunity to complement our power sector work by also taking on some discrete bodies of work related to the transportation and the building sectors. So we added these because they're also significant sources of climate pollution, and our increasingly clean power grid provides a ready alternative to reliance on fossil fuels in these sectors. And finally, there's some overlap in the utility regulatory process, which is where we're most effective. So our work on these sectors is newer, but we're establishing policy frameworks that should continue to pay emission reduction dividends over time.
That's great. Thank you, Erin. Now let's move from these ambitious goals to real world results. Let's hear about the difference your support has made in supporting WRA's work. Jon, back to those 91 million tons. That is huge, but for those of us who aren't climate scientists, how can we truly picture that impact? What does that number mean for our region?
Yeah, it is hard to visualize this when we're talking about climate warming gases and what that reduction number means. But let me try to put it into perspective. If you put the 91 million tons of emissions reductions that we've secured to date into context, that's roughly equivalent to taking 20 million passenger cars off the road for an entire year and doing that each year. It's a truly transformative amount of emissions reductions across our region. And for the West, it's really led to a significant shift in where our electricity comes from. So if you look at the actual reductions in emissions across the interior West, we saw a combined 27% reduction in carbon dioxide emissions by 2024, if you compare that to 2016 levels. And that's a very significant and transformative shift for the region. And it's a major pivot away from fossil fuels for electricity generation. And what's even more exciting about that is that these are the actual reductions through 2024. So many of the policies that we've passed, as this slide shows, bring more coal plants offline, close them down. So we project even more significant emissions reductions by 2030.
That's super helpful. Thank you, Jon. Back to you, Erin. Why is closing coal plants such a big deal for the West?
Well, of all the ways to generate electricity, burning coal is among the most carbon intensive and polluting. So retiring coal-fired power plants creates immediate, significant reductions in the greenhouse gas pollution that drive climate change, but it also reduces harmful air pollutants, which improves air quality and our public health. So over the course of our plan, we found that economics were increasingly working in our favor. Due to broader market shifts, we've seen coal is increasingly expensive when compared to cleaner alternatives. And today, closing most coal plants is actually a cost savings for utility customers. Over the course of the climate fix, we saw the retirement of over 8,000 megawatts of coal capacity, which will avoid approximately 46 million tons of climate pollution every year. And in addition, we've secured commitments for another 5,700 megawatts of coal plant retirements. And that should occur between 2025 and 2030. When it happens, it will avoid an additional 33 million tons of annual greenhouse gas pollution.
That's an awful lot. Erin, I've heard you talk about the 3 pillars of energy transition: reliability, affordability, and sustainability. Could you explain those and why they're important?
Absolutely. So this stuff is complicated. And when we talk about the electric grid, we're talking about a system that, even though we take it for granted, is foundational to our economy and to our modern lives. In some parts of WRA's region, access to electricity to power cooling technologies is literally a matter of life and death. So we need to be really thoughtful when we're crafting policy solutions because the stakes are high. So our policy solutions need to ensure that we can continue to provide reliable electric service to the people who depend on it, that we can keep that service affordable, particularly for residential customers and small businesses. And at the same time, we have to drastically reduce greenhouse gas pollution from the power sector in this decade in order to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. Any solution that doesn't meet all three of those criteria isn't a durable solution. All three are interconnected, and sometimes they can even be in conflict. What makes WRA so effective is our commitment to leaning into these hard questions, bringing the nuance and the thoughtfulness that's required to really advance the energy transition.
I like that. Thanks. Back to you, Jon. We've also seen $69 billion in clean energy investments across our region. Could you put that into context for us? And what does that mean for our states?
Yeah, the work that we have done has driven huge investments in renewable and clean energy across the West. So $69 billion is much more than just a number on a spreadsheet because it represents real economic growth, it represents real jobs and real community benefits and increases in tax base across the West. So these investments are going into building new wind and solar farms, creating advanced battery storage facilities, and upgrading the electric grid. If you're just taking a look at on this slide, you can see, so there's some state examples here. In Arizona, $20 billion in new clean energy investments means thousands of jobs, emerging manufacturing opportunities and new revenue streams. Here in Colorado, we've seen $12 billion in new investments, leading to both a thriving wind and solar industry that's generating new income for counties and providing clean energy to homes and to businesses across the region. In New Mexico, $12 billion, in Nevada with $16 billion. These places are rapidly becoming hubs, in particular for solar development and for other advanced energy technologies. And even in those states where the work can be very difficult, like Utah and Wyoming, we've seen over $4 billion in economic benefits from these transitions.
And Jon, you just mentioned jobs. What does that impact look like across the region?
Yeah, the investments are certainly leading to real reduction in emissions, but it's also building a new and very robust clean energy economy that provides stable and well-paying jobs across the country. In fact, here in Colorado, as of last year, before all of these clean energy projects had even come fully online, there's already more than double the number of jobs in clean energy than there are in the fossil fuel industry. And across the 5 states that we were just talking about, there are more than 2.5 times the number of jobs in the clean energy sector than there are in the fossil fuel sector. So these are huge economic wins for the West as well.
Definitely. Thanks for digging into that. Seeing that incredible impact, it's only natural to ask what we've learned along the way. Erin, we often hear WRA talk about the importance of state-level action. Can you explain why state-level decisions are so important for our ability to make meaningful progress?
Absolutely. So most critical energy choices are made at the state level in places like public utilities commissions and state legislatures. Luckily, these are the places where WRA works most effectively. Many of our staff have prior experience in state government, including working at the regulatory agencies where we now practice. So using this expertise, you can see here the greenhouse gas emission reductions that WRA has secured from the 8 largest utilities in our region since 2016. The best available science tells us that in order to avoid the worst impacts of climate change, we need to reduce emissions from the power sector 80% by 2030 as compared to a 2005 baseline. So here you'll see also the remaining tons that are needed to achieve that science-based goal. Our major utilities in the interior West are at varying degrees of progress in meeting the moment and what's required that science tells us is necessary. In a moment where federal policy is actively hostile to the energy transition, the states are a critical battleground where we can both advance and defend innovative state policy.
That's super helpful. Thank you, Erin. What are some of the key lessons that we've learned over the past 7 years in this work?
So we can make tremendous progress, and we've seen some amazing successes. Xcel, for example, is a national leader in reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and that's in part due to the policy frameworks that WRA helped to build. We've been instrumental in shifting tri-state away from coal, excuse me, and towards an increasingly clean future. And Public Service Company of New Mexico's robust clean energy transformation is delivering real benefits to customers, in part due to WRA's legal advocacy. But that progress is fragile. And so we have to remain vigilant. We must be a consistent presence in the beige rooms where decisions happen, sweating the policy details that others dismiss as in the weeds, but that we know can make all the difference. We've also learned that a core assumption in our initial theory of change was correct, that bigger utilities can catalyze broader transformation. So an example is in Colorado, where the policy framework that we developed in partnership with Xcel has since been expanded and adjusted to include all other electric utilities in the state, and that's driving even bigger change. And then finally, we've learned that we have to be nimble and respond to the new challenges as they arise. This work is not over. There is still so much that needs to be done to address the climate crisis, including in the power sector.
Definitely. Thank you, Erin. Jon, how do we keep our partners and supporters motivated for the long haul?
Yeah, that's a question that we are constantly asking ourselves because it really comes down to celebrating the wins and being transparent about the challenges and going back to the why of why we're doing this work. Getting 91 million tons of emissions reductions and $69 billion in investments in clean energy is something to celebrate. And we do. There are markers, but they're also tangible proof that our collective efforts are making a difference and that your support is driving direct impact. And when we face setbacks, which we do, we share those too because it highlights the critical need for continued vigilance and support and continued advocacy. This is not a time to rest. It is a time to double down on all of our efforts. And most importantly, we have to remind ourselves and our supporters, like those of you who are joining for this webinar, the fundamental why behind our work. We are fighting climate change and we're doing it to sustain the environment, the economy, and the people of the West. And it is really your passion and your commitment and your support that fuels us. And it's what helps to see the real world impact. Your generosity is a very powerful motivator to all of us.
Absolutely. I can speak to that. Thank you both so much for sharing. With those lessons in mind, let's talk about why continued action is so critical. Back to you, Erin. What happens if we don't stay vigilant, especially in states like Arizona, Nevada, and Utah, where we still face significant headwinds for clean energy progress?
Right. So as you can see in the next slide, we've observed an extraordinary transformation in how we generate electricity. In 2016, almost half of our electricity came from coal. And today, the 8 biggest utilities in our region project that more than half of their energy will come from renewables by 2030. But we're facing new challenges, and we risk losing momentum without sustaining and scaling our efforts. The data centers necessary to power artificial intelligence are causing explosive increases in electricity demands and could keep coal on the system longer. At the same time, we're facing new federal threats to the progress that we've already made. So without sustained advocacy from groups like WRA, the risk is that emissions increase, costs increase, and we face even more negative health impacts from our reliance on fossil fuels. It's critical to ensure that our states accelerate and don't back away from the progress that we've already made. Even in a leadership state like Colorado, achieving that last 10% of emission reductions from the power sector is incredibly challenging. and it will require thoughtful policy and smart watchdog advocacy. So every state across our region is different, but there's critical work to be done in each of them.
Mhm. Thanks, Erin. Jon, how do our supporters, people on this very call with us today, impact this work? How does their generosity translate into climate action?
That's simple. The support that you all on this call and other WRA supporters provide to us is the engine that drives our work. It's what allows us to be effective. Your contributions allow us to conduct the deep research and the policy analysis that's needed to challenge utilities, to develop compelling policy proposals, and to effectively advocate for clean energy solutions. It enables us to be the consistent presence that Erin was just talking about, to be there for the long haul, both advancing new victories and defending those that we've already made and pushing for more over time. And simply put, your support enables the capacity, the staff, the expertise that has made the climate fix possible, and it's driven this real world change.
Mhm. Agreed. So now that we've heard a little bit about where we started and where we are today, we have a final two questions about what's next before we move into our Q&A. I'll start with you, Jon. How do we continue to make progress alongside intensifying climate events and increasing energy demand?
I think that's one of the most complex and urgent challenges that we face over this next phase and period of time. The reality is that our changing climate is already complicating our work in some pretty profound ways. We're seeing record heat waves that are boosting cooling demand on the grids of the West. Climate-driven wildfires like those we're seeing right now are causing loss of life, but they're also saddling utilities with enormous liabilities, which can, in an ironic way, hinder clean energy development and investment. And we're seeing accelerating drought fuel concerns about water scarcity across our region. And when you add to these challenges the rapidly growing energy demand from data centers, this surge of power-hungry facilities will further increase states' energy demand and complicate the shift away from fossil fuels. And beyond just the energy sector, the warming climate makes other challenges more acute as well. For instance, we have to take aggressive steps to use less water because climate change is diminishing the amount of water in our rivers. And that threatens both our communities and the critical habitat that fish and wildlife rely upon.
Mhm. That's a sobering thing to hear, but an important overview of the challenges. Thank you, Jon. Amidst these challenges, what are our greatest opportunities?
The challenges are real, and we have to acknowledge that, but I think there are also some really important and large-scale opportunities across the West. First, we know that voters and residents across the West care deeply about climate change and ensuring that they have clean air to breathe in their communities. They genuinely want to see a quicker transition to clean energy, to more wind, more solar, more battery storage. And I think economically, as we discussed earlier, we also have a very powerful story. There are vastly more jobs in clean energy than there are in fossil fuel production across our region. Clean energy is now economically competitive across our region. So the economic engine is really growing in the region. And I think the fact that several utilities in our region are already on track with science-based goals demonstrates that a rapid transition isn't just aspirational, it's entirely possible, it's practical, and other utilities can do that. They're showing what's achievable. And this, I think, only really happens if we continue to advance smart, forward-looking policy across the region.
Mhm. Thank you, Jon. Okay, so one last question for you before we turn it over to you all for questions. How can people on this call make a difference?
Well, the most impactful thing you can do is continue your generous support for WRA. and if possible, consider increasing your support for the organization. While some states in our region have taken meaningful action to address climate change and its impacts, even in leadership states like Colorado and New Mexico, we haven't done enough and we need to do more. The political headwinds are stronger in other places where we still need to see big gains in clean energy and land conservation and in river protection, particularly if you look across the region, Arizona, Nevada, Utah, there's tremendous amount of work to do. These realities mean that the stakes for our climate and for our future are rising daily. And in this evolving landscape, we are focused and we are determined. We know the role that WRA plays in the larger ecosystem of organizations. We know that we can drive proactive progress across this region, and we're ready to lead and to do that. And with your continued partnership, we will.
Thank you. Thank you both for sharing some of this information about the Climate Fix campaign we've just wrapped up. It's really impressive to see the impact from this work and the critical role that our supporters are playing. What we're going to do now is we're going to open up things for questions. Please use the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen to submit your questions. I have a few teed up for us already, but continue to add those. If we do not get to your question today, I'll put up my email address at the end, and I hope you'll reach out to share your thoughts and questions with us, and we can always continue this conversation offline. Let's see, what should we go with first? Okay. The first question is from Andy Franklin. Congratulations on all your achievements in the clean energy transition. I read an article in the New York Times suggesting that the low cost of solar and wind and improvements in battery tech has reached the tipping point, and that it's now cheaper to build renewable electricity generation than that burning based on fossil fuel. Apparently, China is leading the way in this regard. Could you comment on this report on how advocacy and policy changes fit into this picture?
Sure, I'm happy to take a first crack at this. So I think this is exactly right. We've seen over the course of time that I've been doing this work, just a real transformation in the cost effectiveness of many of these clean energy technologies. And we now see that some of those technologies that are more mature, like wind and solar, are cost competitive, even without support, such as the tax credits that are kind of at this point being dismantled. So that's a real point of encouragement. And we have seen in the federal budget bill that it does retain some of the clean energy tax credits for more emerging sources of zero emission technology like energy storage and advanced geothermal, that I'm very interested to see how those continue to advance. What I will say, though, is that economics isn't the full picture. Utilities often have very unintuitive and hard to understand financial incentives. Their incentive is not necessarily always to pursue the lowest cost resources to serve their customers. Their financial incentives are created by the regulatory structure in which they operate. And so one of the things that makes WRA really unique is that we really understand those unique ins and outs of the power sector and their financial incentives and the regulatory structures that they're subject to in order to better align utilities' actions with those actions that are good for climate and good for customers, like moving to more cost-effective and cleaner sources of electricity generation.
That's a great point, Erin. Thank you. John, did you want to add anything to that before we move on? Okay. The next one is from Kara Lynch. Can you address whether the supposed rapid need for data centers will impede company, Meta, Amazon, Google, etc., greenhouse gas goals and or public goals?
Sure. So I think about this all the time now. This is probably like the biggest story going on in energy nerd land right now is the impact of AI and data centers on our energy system. And I think the intuition in the question is exactly right. The levels of electricity demands that are being projected from these data centers that are necessary to enable this new generation of generative artificial intelligence are, quite frankly, as an energy professional, the term I would use is gobsmacking, staggering, unfathomable. So it's really extraordinary, the levels of electricity demands that they're putting out there. And that is necessarily going to complicate the energy transition. You not only need to bring on massive amounts of clean energy in order to meet these new and emerging loads, but you need to do even more than that in order to reduce our reliance on fossil fuels across the entire system. So the rise of data centers and this explosion in demand for electricity raises some really complex policy issues. And one of the things about this issue is that there's not just sort of one solution. There's not just one piece of legislation you can pass and kind of address the impacts of data centers. It really does touch every little nook and cranny of the utility regulatory system. And so I think addressing it effectively requires a deep understanding of that system. And again, an ability to understand the utilities' financial incentives and where they may differ from the state's policy goals to reduce emissions, or from the financial needs of residential customers, for example, who need access to affordable energy. So it's a really thorny question, but one that I think WRA, with our mix of sort of professional expertise and our deep knowledge of our region, is very well situated to address.
Yeah, I want to chime in. I want to get to the second part of that question, which really asked about where the large tech companies that are advancing AI and that are creating the demand for more energy comes from and what that looks like. I think it remains to be seen where Google and Amazon and Meta all really come down in how they seek new sources of energy to fuel their demand that they're creating. You know, those companies certainly have aggressive decarbonization goals that they have sought to advance. And I do think it's going to come to the question of whether or not they will continue to pursue those goals, whether or not they will pursue just an unbridled demand to secure more energy to fuel the expansion of data centers and AI. And I think part of our job, quite frankly, is to figure out how do we create policy solutions in the forums where these decisions are made that allow for that increase, to meeting that increase in demand with new clean energy resources, so that those companies and we across the economy are able to achieve our carbon emissions reductions goals.
And John, as a follow-up to that one, how are we engaging with the tech sector is a question that, it's a longer question, but that's the element that has not yet been covered from Jamie Starr.
Yeah, it's a great question, and one that we are engaging in right now. We're doing several things. Erin already talked about some of the engagement that we have underway in terms of working in those places where utilities are regulated and working from that side. We also have contacts within the tech sector, and we're really trying to figure out how do we partner with them in a way that helps meet their demand and that also reduces carbon emissions. I think this is going to be a long-term effort. We're certainly in some of these fights and battles right now. We're going to both push back against the tech sector when they advance unreasonable demands, and that's going to result in new carbon emissions or carbon emission equivalents on the system. But we also plan to and are engaging with those in the tech sector on how to do this the right way.
The only other thing that I would add is that we do have a report that is going to be coming out imminently that addresses in more detail the impacts of data center on both the energy and water systems in our region. So if you're interested in that, please follow up with Elizabeth and we can get you a copy when it is hot off the presses.
I will also have normal person language that accompanies that report, for those of you who need it, like me. We have another question for you all. How does your clean energy progress impact your work protecting rivers and lands?
Well, it's critical. The progress to advance clean energy is very important, and to advance clean energy and to reduce emissions is critical in this overall question of protecting Western lands, habitat, wildlife, and ensuring that we have rivers that are vibrant and flowing over time. The warmer the climate gets, the more challenged we are in terms of our ability to meet our goals, to ensure we have water for our communities, for habitat, for wildlife, et cetera. There are also challenges to advancing new sources of energy, whether they're clean or not, and how do you meet the demand for more electricity. So as an example, anytime a new oil or gas well is drilled, there are impacts on the land and on habitat, in addition to those impacts that we see in terms of warming our climate and in terms of localized pollution impacts. There are impacts that are also true when you develop renewable energy. And so part of the work that both our energy team and our Western Lands Conservation team is doing together is to really figure out, how do we site new clean energy resources in a very responsible way. So we know we need to bring more clean energy onto the grid. We know we need to do that on massive scale. How do we do that in a way that has the least impact on lands that need to be protected, species that need to be protected, and habitat that needs to be protected? I do think that's one of the unique skill sets of WRA, is figuring out those complex sets of problems that really cross over the sets of issues that we work on. So it's not just that we need to bring on massive amounts of clean energy. We need to do that in a way that is protective of habitat, of wildlife, and of those other resources that we value so much across the West.
Thanks, John. We're getting lots of questions, so thank you so much for using that Q&A function. Keep sending them. We'll continue to rattle them off. The next one is a kind of mismatch of a couple of different questions that we put together. What about some of these other states that are major coal burners, like Wyoming? How can we stop pursuing our use of coal if places like Wyoming are using a significant amount of coal for electricity production?
So I can address this specifically in the context of Wyoming. So we have a team in Utah that is deeply engaged in advocacy with PacifiCorp, which is a multi-state utility serving, I believe, 6 states, from as far east as Wyoming to as west as Washington and Oregon. And you can imagine all the different climate policies that you have across that service territory. So our engagement with PacifiCorp through that multi-state process is in part focused on getting at some of those coal plants that are located in Wyoming. So our work in Utah doesn't just impact Utah. It also impacts those eastern states in the PacifiCorp service territory. Hopefully that's helpful.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of those states where political headwinds are particularly strong, what are some of the most significant policy or regulatory hurdles that we're encountering?
So I think there are a number. There's no shortage of sort of hurdles right now. I think one hurdle is just the uncertainty in the federal policy environment and the federal economic environment, honestly. So the clean energy transition is impacted by federal policy, like the recently passed budget bill. It's also impacted by things that affect the supply chain, like the imposition of tariffs that can affect the cost of clean energy components that are necessary to build the electricity generation that we need. So I think that uncertainty and churn that we're seeing at the federal level is certainly a challenge. In addition, I think that we've got different challenges depending on the state that you're kind of looking at. I think data centers are exploding across our region, but we've found that Arizona is really like a top 5 national hotspot for AI data center development. And so it's really driving a level of load growth in Arizona that's particularly notable, especially when you consider the fact that that state has such immense cooling needs, and those cooling needs are incredibly energy intensive, and such a water constrained environment as well. So I would say those are two that kind of immediately come to mind. But John, what would you add?
Yeah, I'd add one, Aaron. I think those are absolutely right. The one that I would add is you can't really contemplate the policy environment without talking about the political environment. And we have a region in which we have two real leadership states in Colorado and New Mexico. And I think the question there is there the political will to get that last 10 to 15% of emissions reductions that we need to see on the utility systems in those states? The other states in our region are even more difficult politically. We have some real challenges, and we're going to have to build some significant capacity beyond the policy capacity and the government affairs capacity and the marketing and communications capacity that we have today in order to drive victories in places where there's very strong support for clean energy. There's very strong support for emissions reduction and action on climate change among the public, but that support has not translated into those who are making decisions about those systems in those states. So when we talk about Arizona, we talk about Nevada, we talk about Utah and other states across our region, we're not only dealing with the challenges that Erin mentioned, but also very challenging political environments that can make it more difficult to advance the policies that we need to see.
Definitely. Thanks for those answers. We're gonna finish on this last question. The recent budget bill will impact clean energy progress and promote fossil fuels. What are the risks, and what is WRA's strategy to navigate these shifts?
So I would say that the risks are those that we identified earlier. The risks are locking in continued reliance on fossil fuels that's going to drive faster and more extreme climate change, and that's going to degrade our air quality and our health. I think that our role right now, we are diving deep into the impacts of this budget bill and crafting new and innovative policy solutions that are more durable to attacks or challenges from the federal level. So we are in the process of updating this kind of playbook and ensuring that our advocacy that is informed by our expertise and our institutional knowledge of our states is being utilized in order to craft the next generation of innovative policy that's going to be necessary to meet this moment.
Yeah, Erin's absolutely right. We have to both be able to play defense and fight off the worst attacks on our agenda and on action that's already taken place on climate and clean energy to advance climate and clean energy. And that's a reality. And I think that's true for us. It's true for our partners across the region and partners across the country. I think the other thing that we have to really make sure we focus on is, WRA's unique niche is driving state-based policy. We've talked about this earlier, and we cannot give up on aggressive and effective climate action in the states. And in fact, that's the only thing we're going to see over these next several years. And so we have to invest, we have to double down, and we have to do everything we can to get every ton of emissions reductions that we can so that we keep us close to path, so that hopefully in some future time, we have a federal administration that's going to act with the appropriate level of ambition and haste to really get us on track to meet the science-based goals.
Thank you. And thank you all for your thoughtful questions and commitment to our mission. We're truly appreciative of your support of the Climate Fix and all the other work that WRA does. We're adding a link now to the chat that'll give you a glimpse at a report that'll dive even deeper into the Climate Fix and the work that you've supported over the years. You can dig in on your leisure and, of course, follow up with any questions that you might have about some of those impacts. We also want to extend a special thank you to our Climate Fix event sponsors, Conservation Colorado, First Bank, and Healthy Air and Water Colorado. Partnerships are how WRA is able to do this important work. Collaboration is very key to our shared successes, from individuals who give to businesses who sponsor to other nonprofit partners who we do this complementary work with. We're really grateful for all of you. As we look ahead, the urgency of this work continues to grow, and your support is essential to our success. We invite you to continue to be a part of this work and continue the conversation. My email is up on the screen. I'd love to have a conversation with you. And like I said, I don't know all the answers to these questions, but I know people who do, and I'd love to connect you with them. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're really grateful for you. Hope everyone has a delightful afternoon.